Elara Weston balanced a silver tray in one hand, weaving through the dimly lit, opulent dining hall of the Sinclair estate. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow on the long mahogany table, where men in tailored suits and women in designer gowns laughed over glasses of aged wine. She adjusted her black apron, keeping her head down. This wasn't her world. She was here to serve, not to be noticed. Elara, table 3, her manager hissed under his breath, nodding toward the far end of the room. She turned and nearly tripped when her eyes landed on the man sitting at the head of the table. His presence commanded attention, even in a room full of wealth and power. Dark hair, strong jaw, piercing blue eyes that flickered with something unreadable as he lifted his glass to his lips. Yarrow Hastings. She didn't know much about him, only that he was the reason for tonight's extravagant private dinner. Some whispered he was a ruthless businessman, others said he was impossible to impress. But to her, he was just another guest who'd probably forget her face by the end of the evening. She straightened her shoulders and approached, carefully setting down a fresh glass of wine beside his plate. "Thank you," he said, his voice smooth, deep. She glanced up, startled. Millionaires didn't usually thank the help. Their eyes met for a brief moment and something flickered in his gaze: curiosity, amusement, she wasn't sure, but it sent a shiver down her spine. Elara, her manager's sharp voice cut through the moment, making her step back. "Keep moving." She tore her gaze away, nodding before slipping back into the rhythm of serving. But throughout the night, she felt his eyes on her. By the time dessert was served, the air in the room had shifted. The guests were deep in conversation, laughter rolling through the hall, but Yarrow remained quiet. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching her. "Elara, is it?" The sound of her name from his lips made her freeze. She turned, finding him looking at her with the same unreadable expression. "Oh, yes, sir." "You've been on your feet all night." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you ever get a break?" "I'll sit when my shift is over," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm. A slow smile played on his lips, like he was amused by her defiance. Fair enough. Her heart pounded as she turned away, forcing herself to focus on the dishes in her hands instead of the way. His voice sent warmth curling through her chest. But as the night went on, it became clear that Yarrow Hastings wasn't done with her. When the dinner ended and the guests began to leave, she moved to clear the table. That's when she felt him step beside her. "Let me help you with that." She nearly dropped the tray. "You don't have to." "I want to." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. No one had ever offered to help her before, especially not someone like him. As he reached for an empty glass, their fingers brushed. A jolt of electricity shot up her arm, and she saw the way his jaw tightened, as if he felt it too. "Elara," he said softly. She swallowed hard. "Yes." "I'd like to see you again." His voice was low, intimate, like it was meant for her ears only. Her breath hitched. "I don't think that's a good idea." Something dark flashed in his eyes, but instead of pressing, he simply nodded. "For now." And with that, he walked away, leaving her heart racing and her world tilting on its axis. Elara stacked the last of the dishes in the industrial sink, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness settling in. The dining hall had emptied out, leaving only the quiet hum of the overhead lights and the occasional clatter of silverware as the other staff finished their work. She exhaled, pressing her palms against the counter. The night had been exhausting, but not because of the endless trays or demanding guests. It was him. Yarrow Hastings had disrupted the predictable rhythm of her evening with nothing more than a few words and an intensity in his gaze that had lingered long after he was gone. She shook her head, pushing the memory aside. It didn't matter. Men like him existed in a different reality, one she had no business stepping into. Elara, her manager's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You're done for the night." She nodded, untying her apron and hanging it on the hook by the door before grabbing her coat from the back room. The night air was crisp as she stepped outside, the scent of rain heavy in the air. She pulled her coat tighter around her, ready for the long walk home. "Elara." The deep voice sent a jolt through her. She turned abruptly, her pulse kicking up when she saw Yarrow leaning against a sleek black car parked near the curb. His jacket was undone, the top button of his shirt loosened as if he had shed the formalities of the evening. She hesitated. "What are you doing here?" "I had a feeling you'd be walking home," he said, straightening. "Let me drive you." She blinked at him, caught between surprise and suspicion. "That's not necessary." He tilted his head slightly, considering her. "You don't trust me." "I don't know you," she corrected. A slow exhale left him and he took a measured step closer. "Then let me change that." She should have walked away. She should have ignored the way his presence made it suddenly difficult to breathe. But against all logic, she found herself standing still, her fingers tightening in the fabric of her coat. "You don't need to do this," she said, her voice quieter now. "I don't do things I don't want to," he countered. "And right now, I want to make sure you get home safely." Something about the way he said it, firm, unwavering, made resistance feel futile. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. The car's interior was warm, the scent of leather and something distinctly him wrapping around her as she settled into the passenger seat. He slid in beside her, the engine purring to life with effortless smoothness. She clasped her hands together, glancing at him as he pulled onto the road. "You don't seem like the kind of man who usually goes out of his way for people." His grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly. "You'd be right." The admission sent a shiver through her, though she wasn't sure why. "So why me?" she asked. His jaw flexed as if he wasn't used to being questioned. "Because you intrigue me." She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "I'm a waitress, there's nothing intriguing about me." His gaze flicked toward her briefly before returning to the road. "That's where you're wrong." The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. As they neared her apartment, she pointed to the modest brick building on the corner. "This is me." He pulled up to the curb, shifting the car into park. She reached for the door handle but hesitated. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Get some rest, Elara." She stepped out, closing the door behind her. As she made her way into the building, she could feel his gaze lingering, as if he wasn't quite ready to let her go just yet. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, she wasn't sure she wanted him to. Elara's world had always been predictable: long shifts, tired feet, and barely enough time to dream beyond the next paycheck. But ever since the night Yarrow Hastings had driven her home, her thoughts had been anything but predictable. She hadn't expected to see him again. Men like him didn't linger in the lives of women like her. Yet 3 nights later, as she stepped into the restaurant for another shift, she stopped short. He was there, seated at a private table near the back, effortlessly composed, as if he belonged in every room he entered. A sharp navy suit framed his broad shoulders, and his fingers drummed lightly against the tablecloth. He wasn't reading the menu or making conversation with anyone. He was waiting. For her. She forced herself to move, her heart thudding in a way she didn't understand. As she approached his table, she kept her voice even. "Mr. Hastings." His lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Elara." She straightened her notepad. "Are you dining alone tonight?" For now, his gaze flickered over her, unreadable. "I was hoping you'd join me." Her breath caught. "That's not how this works." "Rules can be bent," he said smoothly, "especially for the right company." She should have declined, walked away, pretended this was nothing more than a customer flirting with a waitress. But something about the way he watched her, as if waiting for a challenge, made her pulse skitter. "I have tables to serve," she said, lifting her chin. "1 meal," he countered. "Then you can get back to pretending you don't want to sit down." Her lips parted, but before she could argue, her manager appeared at her side, his expression tight. "Elara, take your break." She turned to him, startled, but now his tone left no room for debate. She glanced back at Yarrow, who merely gestured to the empty seat across from him, as if he already knew she'd give in. With a hesitant breath, she lowered herself into the chair. The moment she did, the energy between them shifted. You don't like being told what to do, he observed. She crossed her arms, and you do. A low chuckle escaped him. I prefer being the one giving orders. She expected arrogance, but there was something else in his expression, something sharp, like a man who carried too much weight on his shoulders. She reached for the water glass in front of her, needing something to occupy her hands. Why are you here? I told you, he said, leaning forward slightly. You intrigue me. A warmth crept up her spine, but she ignored it. You don't even know me. His gaze didn't waver, not yet. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. She exhaled, this isn't my world, Yarrow. His expression darkened slightly, as if the words unsettled him. I never said it had to be. For a moment, the restaurant faded around them. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, it all blurred into the background. Then, breaking the tension, a waiter placed a dish in front of her. She frowned. I didn't order anything. I did, Yarrow said simply. She stared at the plate, something far too expensive, too exquisitely plated for someone used to scraping by. I don't need you to do this, she said quietly. I know, his voice was softer now, but I wanted to. A war waged in her chest. She should have pushed the plate away, refused whatever game he was playing. But there was something unsettling about how effortlessly he saw through her, how he knew she'd never accept anything she hadn't earned. So instead of arguing, she picked up her fork. The slight shift in his posture told her he considered that a victory. As she took a bite, he watched her with quiet intensity. Tell me something about you. She hesitated. What do you want to know? On everything. A nervous laugh escaped her. That's not going to happen. He tilted his head, then start small. She searched for something safe, something that wouldn't make her feel exposed. I used to love painting. His brows lifted slightly. Used to. She shrugged. Life got in the way. Something flickered in his expression. Understanding, maybe. Before she could change the subject, he spoke again, his voice thoughtful. You should paint again. She let out a breath. It's not that simple. Most things aren't, he admitted, doesn't mean they're impossible. She hated how easily he got under her skin, how his words made her chest tighten in ways she wasn't prepared for. Her break was nearly over. She should have been relieved. Instead, she found herself dreading the moment she'd have to stand up and walk away. As if sensing it, Yarrow leaned back, watching her with that same unreadable expression. This won't be the last time we sit across from each other. She met his gaze, something dangerous curling in her stomach. You sound awfully sure of that. His lips curved slightly, because I am. And as much as she wanted to deny it, she knew deep down he wasn't wrong. Elara hadn't meant to let Yarrow Hastings into her life. She had spent years keeping her world small, predictable. She didn't have time for distractions, let alone a man whose presence was anything but simple. And yet, here she was, standing outside a gallery she never would have stepped foot in before, her fingers curled around the invitation he had slipped into her apron pocket 2 nights ago. The street bustled with well-dressed patrons moving in and out of the grand entrance, laughter and conversation drifting through the open doors. Inside, chandeliers cast a soft glow over the polished floors, illuminating the artwork that lined the walls. She wasn't supposed to be here. And yet she stepped inside. The moment she did, her breath caught. Yarrow stood near the center of the room, surrounded by people who spoke in low, admiring tones. He wore a dark suit, effortlessly commanding, his presence drawing attention without him even trying. But the moment his eyes found hers, the conversation around him faded. He moved toward her with purpose, his expression unreadable. When he reached her, his voice was quieter than usual. You came. She lifted the invitation slightly. You didn't really give me a choice. Something in his gaze softened, though his expression remained composed. I was hoping you wouldn't find a reason to say no. She glanced around, taking in the space. I don't belong here. His response was immediate. You belong anywhere you choose to be. Her heart twisted at the sincerity in his tone. She didn't know how to respond to that, so instead, she turned her attention to the nearest painting. It was bold, full of color and movement, the kind of piece that made you stop and feel something before you even understood why. This one is yours, he said. She frowned, looking back at him. What? I bought it. His eyes didn't leave her face. For you. Her breath hitched. Yarrow. You told me you used to love painting, he continued, his voice steady. I don't want you to forget what it feels like to create something that makes you feel alive. She stared at him at the sheer weight of what he had done. It wasn't just about the painting. It was about the way he saw her, the way he listened even when she thought her words were nothing more than passing confessions. She opened her mouth to argue, to tell him he didn't need to do this, but he spoke first. You don't have to accept it, he said, quieter now. But I needed you to know that someone believes in you. Her throat tightened. No one had ever done something like this for her before. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away before the emotion in his gaze completely unraveled her. You do things like this often. His lips pressed together as if he were weighing his words carefully. No. Her chest ached at the honesty in that single word. Before she could say anything else, someone called his name from across the room. He exhaled, glancing in the direction of the voice before returning his attention to her. Stay, he said, at least for a little while. She should have said no, she should have turned and walked out the door. But instead, she nodded. For the next hour, she let herself exist in his world. He introduced her to people whose names she would never remember, guided her through the gallery with an ease that made it seem as if she belonged there just as much as anyone else. And through it all, his hand remained close to hers, never touching but always within reach. By the time the event began to wind down, they found themselves standing near the exit, the cool night air drifting in from the open doors. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. Come with me. Her pulse fluttered. Where? His voice was quiet, almost careful. Somewhere that isn't here. She hesitated, every logical part of her screaming that this was dangerous, that she was in too deep. But then she looked into his eyes, and every excuse she had prepared vanished. She nodded. The drive was quiet, the city lights blurring past them as he took a route she didn't recognize. When he finally pulled onto a secluded road, her breath caught. A private terrace overlooked the skyline, lanterns casting a warm glow over the space. A single table was set near the edge, candles flickering against the evening breeze. She turned to him, overwhelmed. Yarrow. I wanted to give you a night that was just ours, he said simply. Her chest tightened. This is too much. His gaze was steady. It's exactly enough. She didn't know how to fight him on this, so she didn't. They ate under the stars, the conversation softer now, more intimate. He told her about the first time he had ever bought a painting for himself, about the way art made him feel something beyond the weight of business and responsibility. She told him about the nights she used to stay up painting until dawn, about the way colors could capture emotions words never could. And when the meal was finished, when the wine glasses were nearly empty, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. Elara, he murmured. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. Yes. His eyes darkened, his thumb tracing over her knuckles. Tell me to stop. Oh, she didn't. Instead, she leaned in, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the differences between their worlds, not the fears that whispered warnings in the back of her mind. Because when his lips finally met hers, every reason she had to walk away disappeared entirely. Elara stood at the edge of the terrace, the city lights stretching beneath her like a glittering ocean. The breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine, mingling with the lingering warmth of Yarrow's presence beside her. The night felt endless, suspended in a quiet kind of magic she didn't dare disturb. His fingers brushed against hers, a touch so light it could have been accidental, but she knew it wasn't. You're thinking too much, Yarrow murmured, his voice low. She turned to find him watching her, the flickering candlelight reflecting in his eyes. Is that a bad thing? She asked. Not always, he admitted, but right now I'd rather know what you're feeling instead. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I feel like I'm in a place I was never meant to be. His expression darkened slightly, and why is that? You know why, she said. This world, your world, it isn't mine. Yarrow let out a slow breath, as if he had expected her doubt but refused to accept it. Elara, do you really think I care about that? You should, she whispered. Then maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do. His voice was quiet but firm. I don't want someone who fits into some perfect mold. I want you. The certainty in his words sent a shiver down her spine. She wished she could believe it could be that simple. You barely know me, she said, shaking her head. That's not true, he countered. I know you don't take things you haven't earned. I know you carry more weight on your shoulders than you let people see. And I know that when you look at a painting, you don't just see color, you see stories. Her breath caught at how easily he unraveled her. You make it sound like you've figured me out, she murmured. Not yet, he admitted, but I want to. Elara swallowed hard, her resolve wavering. And what happens when you do? He stepped closer, the space between them vanishing. Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel like you don't belong. Her heart pounded, the weight of his words settling deep within her. She should have walked away, should have reminded herself that nights like this didn't last. But instead, she let herself believe just this once that maybe they could. Yarrow reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. Come with me. She didn't ask where, somehow it didn't matter. They left the terrace behind, stepping into the sleek black car that had brought them here. The air inside was thick with something unspoken, the tension humming between them as the city blurred past the windows. He didn't take her back to her apartments. Instead, the car pulled up outside a building that loomed tall and elegant, its glass facade reflecting the skyline. A doorman nodded as Yarrow led her inside, guiding her into a private elevator. She glanced at him, her pulse quickening. Where are we going? Oh, you'll see. The doors slid open, revealing a penthouse bathed in soft golden light. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the cityscape, and the space was impossibly vast, yet somehow intimate. Elara stepped inside, her breath catching. This is your home. It is, he confirmed, and tonight it's yours too. She turned to him, hesitating. Yarrow. He reached for her hand again, his touch grounding. No expectations, no pressure, just stay. Her chest tightened. Why? Because I don't want this night to end, he admitted, and I don't think you do either. She exhaled, the weight of the evening pressing into her in the best way. For once, she didn't argue. The hours that followed were filled with quiet confessions, laughter that came easier than she expected, and a closeness that felt as inevitable as the sunrise. By the time exhaustion settled over her, Yarrow led her to a room with windows overlooking the city, the bed covered in crisp white sheets that looked softer than anything she'd ever known. She hesitated at the doorway, looking back at him. You really mean it, she said, no expectations. His expression was serious yet gentle. I just want you to be here, Elara. Something inside her unraveled at his words. And so, for the first time in a long time, she let herself stay. Elara awoke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the expansive windows, casting golden streaks across the plush bedding. The quiet hum of the city below felt distant, as if she had stepped into a different world entirely. For a few blissful moments, she let herself exist in the peace of it before the weight of reality pressed in. She turned her head, finding Yarrow seated in a nearby chair, one leg crossed over the other, a cup of coffee resting in his hand. He was already dressed, his crisp white shirt open at the collar, dark slacks tailored to perfection. His gaze was steady, unreadable as it settled on her. You didn't sleep, she murmured. A slow exhale left him. I didn't want to miss a moment. The words sent warmth curling through her, but she forced herself to sit up, pushing back against the sensation. This, whatever this was, it couldn't last. I should go, she said, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. Yarrow's expression darkened slightly, but he remained composed. Why? She hesitated, fingers gripping the sheets. Because this isn't real. He set his cup down on the table beside him, rising to his feet. What exactly isn't real? This, she gestured between them, frustration creeping into her tone. Me waking up in a penthouse like I belong here, you looking at me like I'm something you want to keep. His jaw flexed, and for the first time something unguarded flickered in his eyes. And why shouldn't I? Because I'm not meant for this life, Yarrow, she said, voice soft but firm. I don't fit into this world of power and luxury. He took a step closer, his presence commanding. You think I care about any of that? She met his gaze, her heart pounding. You should. A muscle ticked in his jaw, but then his expression shifted, resolve settling over him like a storm rolling in. Come with me. She frowned, aware. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, his grip warm, steady. Trust me. Against every logical instinct, she did. They rode down in the elevator in silence, Yarrow's grip never leaving hers. When they stepped outside, a sleek car awaited them, but instead of the bustling city streets, he directed the driver toward a quieter part of town. Minutes later, the car pulled to a stop in front of a small, sunlit building with floor-to-ceiling windows. The sign above the door read, Weston Art Studio. Elara's breath caught. She turned to Yarrow, her voice barely above a whisper. What is this? He watched her carefully. It's yours. She shook her head, unable to process the weight of what he was saying. Yarrow, no, I can't accept this. You can't, he said, his tone unwavering, and you will. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. Why would you do this? He stepped closer, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache. Because I believe in you, Elara, and I want you to believe in yourself too. Her throat tightened. You can't just fix my life with grand gestures. I'm not trying to fix anything, he murmured. I just want to give you the chance to dream again. A tear slipped down her cheek and he brushed it away with his thumb. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Then let me show you, he said. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she let herself hope. Months passed and the studio became more than just a space, it became a place where Elara rediscovered herself. She painted late into the nights, poured her soul into every brushstroke, and for the first time in years she felt free. And through it all, Yarrow was there. Not as a benefactor, not as a man trying to claim her, but as a partner, someone who stood beside her without expectation. It terrified her at first, how easily he fit into her life, how natural it felt to have him beside her. But the walls she had spent years building crumbled under the weight of his unwavering presence. One evening, as she wiped the paint from her hands, she turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with that quiet intensity she had come to know so well. She smiled. You're staring. He stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. I've been waiting for the right moment. Her brow furrowed. For what? Yarrow took her hand, his fingers steady as he lowered himself onto one knee. Elara's breath hitched. I don't want a life without you, he said, his voice uncharacteristically raw. Not in my world, not in yours, just us together. Tears welled in her eyes, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Marry me, Yarrow continued, his grip tightening. Not because of grand gestures or because I can give you everything, but because you are everything. A choked laugh escaped her, and she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion lodged in her throat. Yarrow exhaled, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just a dream. This was real. This was forever. The wedding was intimate, a quiet ceremony in a garden bathed in golden sunlight. There were no extravagant displays, no overwhelming crowds, just the people who mattered most. As Yarrow took her hands in his gaze never once wavered. You are my greatest risk, he murmured, and my only certainty. Elara's chest tightened, love swelling inside her. And you are the one thing I never saw coming, but the only thing I'll never let go. As they exchanged vows as his lips met hers, the world around them faded. Because in the end, it had never been about wealth or status. It had been about them. And that was more than enough.